Hello and welcome to Inequality Talks, a podcast from the volunteers at Mellemfolkeligt Samvirke Aarhus. On Inequality Talks, we discuss concepts and interview experts on ideas relating to economic inequality, learning and sharing knowledge about what it is and how best to address it. Today's episode is a special collaboration with our local feminist group. I am Adam, and with me today are
Kirsi, Rebekah.
Today we're going to be talking about the gender pay gap and how economic inequality operates along gendered lines. First, if you guys could just say a few brief sentences about who you are, your background, and where you come at this topic from.
I'm Kirsi. I come from Estonia, but I have lived here in Denmark for the best part of my adult life, the last 8 or almost 9 years now. And I have done my bachelor's and master's degree here in classical guitar from the Royal Music Academy of Aarhus. And at the moment, I work as a freelance musician and also as a guitar teacher at Skanderborg and also at Aarhus Music School as a substitute. I am also a co-coordinator for the feminist group here at MS, which brings me here to this podcast today. I come from the topic from the viewpoint that there is still a lot of problems to be addressed and that it is still an issue since very often it gets downplayed. But there is a lot to talk about, there is a lot to improve on, and I'm very happy to be here to get to discuss that.
Thanks, Kirsi. Rebekah?
Yeah, I'm Rebekah Vaglini. I'm an assistant professor of computational linguistics at Aarhus University. I've lived in Denmark for the last 3 years. I'm from the US, and that's where I got my education. I come at this from the perspective of I'm not an expert in gender issues in particular or in income inequality, but as a linguist and as a computational linguist in particular, one of the things that I'm concerned about is this issue of sort of algorithmic injustice and seeing how a biased world produces data that when it's used for producing algorithms and data-based models of the world can perpetuate the injustices and the biases that we'd really like to solve as a society. So it can sort of become a vicious cycle. So that's one of the places where my interest in feminism stems from. That's very close to my career choices. Also, as a woman in academia, especially in a technical field, I am very aware of the issues, the inequalities that persist. I am a member of the MS feminist group alongside Kirsi, and I've been part of it for about a year now.
Thank you, Rebekah. I'm Adam. As people who've heard other episodes might know, I have a PhD in English literature, and I had a broad focus on sort of politics and society. I've continued that interest, and now I am the co-coordinator of the Economic Inequality Group. Obviously, I'm interested in society, I'm interested in inequality. This is one of the hugest areas of inequality in our society, and you see it everywhere. One of the reasons I wanted to move to Denmark, actually, is because Denmark is, compared to the UK, egalitarian in a lot of ways, but I was quite surprised when I went to the Women's Museum, which I believe is now called the Gender Museum, and discovered that the gender pay gap in Denmark really isn't that much better than it is in the UK. So clearly it persists everywhere, really. But today I'm going to leave it more up to you guys as the resident experts. So let's start with, the very basic terms for anyone who's maybe not familiar with the topic or wants a refresher. What is the gender pay gap in the most basic terms? What does that mean?
Well, it consists of many parts. For the first, of course, the obvious pay discrimination, a direct pay discrimination, which means that women get paid less per hour than men. But then there is also an indirect pay discrimination, which comes to be when there are companies that pay less per hour to part-time workers. And because women make up around 3/4 of the part-time workers in the world, then it affects women the most. And why women do that is because they still take care most of the caregiving work and all the domestic duties. And all of that adds up to the fact that they just simply don't have time for a full-time work. So they choose the part-time work if they have the possibility. And besides that, women also make up most of the lower paid sector workers, such as cleaning industry, food industry, customer service, nursing, and etc. And that's, again, the numbers are up to 3/4 of the workers there. And lastly, there is also within an industry or within a company, women mostly make up the lower paid workers there, since we don't see many women in management and in the board member groups. So not that many decision makers amongst women.
Yeah, I think that was a really great response. I guess I would just add, the gender wage gap as a generic term just refers obviously to the gap in earnings between men and women, but there are at least 4 things to take into account, that all of which may involve bias. So different industries and jobs worked. So the fact that nursing is a lower paid profession, it could actually be a result of it being disproportionately staffed by women. And I was actually just reading a study about how the occupation with the most, with the highest rate of violent attacks is nursing, not policing. And you can imagine that, one of the reasons why we pay police really good salaries is because we think of it as dangerous work, and we need to compensate that work very highly. Nursing is also a critical public-facing occupation that involves a lot of risk for the people doing the work. It's paid disproportionately much lower, probably because it's disproportionately staffed by women. You also have to get more education to be a nurse than to be usually a public police officer. So these things can be sort of systemic. One of the things we might talk about later is computer programming, which was originally a women's occupation. It was paid about on par with secretarial work until it became a male-associated position, and now computer programmers make a ton of money. I could be making double or 3 times my salary if I took my programming skills into the tech industry rather than in academia. And then, as Kirsi said, the types of jobs women work tend to be in the lower paid sector, not in management or leadership. And then differences in hours worked, potentially because of childcare or other household responsibilities.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, that the computer programming one is one of my favorite but also horrifying examples of how it works. So there are divisions in the kind of work that people do and how that's paid, but we've got to be careful about the causal order, because people often say, oh, well, women just choose to do less well-paid jobs. There's a bunch of stuff problematic with that, but also in the same jobs, women will get paid less. Is that correct? Let's talk about how that works, because in a country like Denmark, as far as I'm aware, there are legal protections against employment discrimination in a lot of Western countries. So how does that work? How can it be that, for instance, within the same job, people get paid different amounts?
I read a really striking study put out by the IDA, which is the Association of Engineers in Denmark, which reports a very large gap between the average first salary of newly graduated engineers, male and female, BSc and MSc engineers, despite the same academic qualifications. So that could be either because women are being offered systematically lower salaries just for reasons of bias, or it could be because there's an expectation that first-time employees will negotiate for higher salaries, and for social or cultural or political reasons, women are less likely to do that, or they're not, or they may face repercussions for doing that. So that's a good example, because we know that these people have the exact same qualifications for the jobs. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, as you mentioned, there is very good protection in place here in Denmark, and it's actually all throughout Europe. So European Union has passed a law where it is illegal to discriminate based on sex, based on gender. But funnily enough, only about 1/4 of Europeans know about it. So they recently conducted a study, it was 2019, where they then asked from all countries in Europe, and they made a group of, I think it was about 10,000 people, and only about 26% of them knew that actually you are legally protected. But the problem with that is pay transparency. And that's what we don't have. So like, even if you know that your coworker, for example, your male coworker doing the same work is getting paid more than you, then at court it will be very hard to prove. And that's why there hasn't been that many court cases for this. And that's why the pay gap persists. because we do not have pay transparency. So that would be like one of the first things to kind of eliminate all of this discrimination, because most of it is still happening, of course, in the private sector.
Right. So in the public sector, they have to publish what they're going to be paid. It's always going to be the same based on the job. But in the private sector, you can negotiate.
Not quite, though. So
Okay.
the thing is, I work in the public sector because I work for Aarhus University. There's remarkable transparency. All of our salaries at each level of academic employment is collectively bargained. So you know exactly what the base salary is for every assistant professor in Denmark. We all get the same, but that's base salary. And every year, you have the opportunity to have your union representatives bargain on your behalf for either one-off payments or salary increases. And that's actually where big money and big discrepancies can come through. So unfortunately, we don't have gender-based data on this, but all universities do have data on average salaries per type of faculty position, per type of academic position, and across the different schools. And we can see that there's a real disparity in what, say, a full professor makes. Some are making almost a third more than others, but we don't know the gender of the individuals making more. My guess would be that we would find that male faculty are overall making more than women. Men tend to more often and more effectively negotiate for salary increases and promotion, and there may also be some bias in the process of bargaining. But we don't actually know, and we can't get that data. In some departments, there are only one or two female faculty, so I'm not actually sure that they could release the gender-based data, because it could actually, it wouldn't actually be anonymous, because in some cases there are so few women, you would know exactly who who that one full professor is. There are also a lot of departments where it's only men, so I'm the second woman in my department. So it sounds really great on paper. It sounds very equitable on paper, but there is still a lot of room for inequality to sort of flourish, even in these public sector jobs.
Yeah, that's true. And there are, though, some countries that I can point out that have passed a law, so that, for example, in France, if you have a company with more than 50 employees, then they have to release all the wages just to have the pay transparency. And then in Iceland, it is more than 25 people. And in Poland, they have made a free app where then the employees themselves can go and write their salary, so that another worker of the same caliber can see, okay, they make that much, then I can, for example, even just negotiate my salary to this, because I see that this is possible, or this is the norm. But still, in most of the countries, it's not there.
You make a great point that without transparency, it's really difficult for women and others to advocate effectively on their behalf in these in the bargaining process. So I have the ability to nominate myself for a salary increase every year, but I don't have the data that I might need to know what my skills and competencies should warrant in terms of salary. And I don't really have the network of close and more experienced academics to guide me or tell me. We know that men tend to have stronger networks and more people sort of advocating for them, including in academia. So transparency would really maybe go a long way to helping women know what they should be asking for in terms of salary bonuses.
I mean, it is really notable, like coming to Denmark, for instance, finding what you're meant to ask for in an interview is very, very difficult if you're new to that industry, if you're new to that kind of stuff. And if, because of all kinds of cultural norms, you pitch yourself lower, you're going to have a lower starting salary, and any increase in your salary as well is going to not keep up. But I think we're getting into some other stuff that maybe we want to explore, because you mentioned that you're one of the few women in your department. There's whole departments in the university that don't have any female professors. This gets to the other aspect, which is the division of work, like why people are in certain kind of jobs. How does that persist? Why does that persist? You mentioned some aspects of it being prestige. Is there data on that? Is there evidence you found around how those things operate? Because I have heard a lot of people, and I think it's facetious, say, oh, well, women just choose poorer paid jobs, as if that's any kind of explanation. Even if that were true, you have to ask why, but it's not necessarily true. So how does that persist? Why is there that division?
My short answer would be the meritocracy myth, which is kind of one of the founding beliefs of academia. So it's very much a merit-based system, or it thinks it is, but of course merit is assessed differently for men and women, and women face a lot of obstacles that are not really acknowledged by the system that we have for assessing quality and merit in academia. So there's a pretty notorious study from a few years ago of economics professors, assistant professor level economics professors from the top 50 departments in the US, and maternity and paternity leave. All of these professors, when they had a child, they would go on the family leave, which was instated as a way of kind of leveling the playing field. So in academia, you go on a leave and you usually get an extra year on your tenure clock to make up for the time that you lose for childcare. And what was found was that the parental leave actually advantaged men. So they had about a 20% better chance of getting tenure after that leave, because they used the time to, write papers and do some things for their careers, whereas women either wouldn't or couldn't use the time for anything except its intended purpose, which was childcare. So actually the family leave disadvantaged women relative to men more than they were when it was only women who were taking a family leave. So this is the sort of unintended consequences of policies that prioritize equality, or treating people exactly the same, instead of equity, which is actually recognizing that a merit-based system, and a system that tries to treat men and women fairly and assess them totally equally, it's not going to actually be effective in closing the gap between men and women unless we take into account how these policies affect them differently. So I think that's a really persistent issue in academia.
That's pretty horrifying. Also, because you hear those horror stories about leave only being for women, or shared leave only being used by women. And if I had a kid, I'd want to spend a good chunk of time with it. But that's not actually a beneficial policy for women is pretty horrifying. So there's something there about some very deeply ingrained norms about surrounding childcare, for instance, that you mentioned in your introduction. Kirsi, would you like to speak a bit more to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is a big bias of women being the main caregivers, taking care of the children, taking care of the household, all the domestic duties, and that takes a huge amount of time from their everyday life. And it's estimated that especially women who have children, that the time they spend on domestic duties while working is still somewhere between 3 and 6 hours, whereas men spend only about half an hour up to 2 hours. So there is still a big disparity there. And another factor, besides all the physical work that women do through caregiving and domestic duties, is also the mental load, because women are also the main planners for the family. And even though I have, for example, from a personal perspective, I have many friends, many couples that also try to really find a balance between the work that they do at home, but very often it turns out still that the woman is the planner. So the woman is kind of telling her partner, do this and do this and do this, and you have to do it at this time or that time. That's how we can make the childcare work. Or it's mostly still the planning work as well, which is taking a lot of time, and mostly from women. But talking more about parental leave, it is a huge taboo still in many places. And I come from Estonia, which is, let's say, not the most gender equal, especially since the gender wage gap is the biggest in Europe, in Estonia. Yeah, it's upwards 18-19%, and the European average is 14.3%. So it's up there, and also just about 5 years ago, it was still looked weirdly upon when a father would take a leave to go and take care of the child. So it is not only that fathers maybe want to spend time with their children, but it's also society that kind of looks at them weirdly. Why would you do that? So now it's getting better, and we also see it in the numbers in Europe that, for example, in Sweden, fathers already take up to 30% of the leave that they can to also be with the child during the first year. But when we look at the numbers here in Denmark, it is down in 10-11%. So the system here in Denmark, just to give a quick overview, is that the mother can take a month before giving birth. She can already get her child leave. And then during the next 14 weeks, the father can take 2 weeks of that. And then afterwards, they have shared 32 weeks that they can then share between them and even like take it at the same time. But still, it's only down to 11% that men take. So it's still a natural bias still across Europe for men to take way less time.
Apparently there was a really radical thing that Sweden had to do to get men to take more of the paternity leave, because paternity leave has been a right in Sweden since the 1970s. But until a few years ago, the numbers of Swedish fathers who were taking family leave was more in line with what we see in Denmark, about 11%. But then they mandated this use it or lose it policy for paternal leave. So now you have, I think it's up to 4 months now of a paid paternal leave. And if you don't use that, it can't be shared with the mother, essentially. So only the father can take that time. And so it's use it or lose it. And that has brought the number of men taking their promised paternal leave up to 30%. It does appear that a large part of Denmark's wage gap is related to women having children and leaving the workforce, even though they're entitled to do so during the family leave time. So according to Statistics Denmark, among single people in Denmark, women are actually the higher earners. They have larger net wealth than men, slightly higher, but higher. But then this reverses as soon as women enter into couples, and usually women in heterosexual couples, in most cases there will be children. So in only 29% of Danish couples is the woman the higher earner. And a Danish researcher at Princeton discovered that the sharp decline in Danish women's earnings follows the birth of their first child, but there's no comparable sort of salary drop-off for men. And it looks like it's a combination of things. So women coming back to work, they're offered less hours on the job. They are overlooked for promotion at a higher rate than male colleagues who have gone on family leave. And the cumulative effect of this is that basically there's a gap that starts with the birth of the first child that just never closes between men and women in Danish heterosexual couples. So the cumulative effect is that women make 20% less than their male counterparts on average over the course of their career. And this is in Denmark, a country that really has taken great steps to try to achieve more gender equality in the workplace.
Wow.
Yeah, it's quite crazy. I mean, I also read this study made in Germany from OECD, and they estimated that women who have children and women who don't have children by the age of 45, the difference in money-wise they can make is about 235,000 euros. Like it is a ridiculous amount, and just because of the choice of having children. So it's really affecting. And they also had the numbers that average woman, therefore, who has kids, earns between actually even 31 to 75% less than men. But of course, that's taking every country in the world kind of into consideration where they can collect data, which is still quite scary to look at those numbers. But also another aspect of parental leave is how much money you can actually get during that. So for example, there are only 12 countries that give your full salary, and that's only up to 3 to 6 months. And I think they didn't actually include my country in the study, but in Estonia you can get up to 1.5 years. So I think that is actually the best system I have found. Only, not to take into consideration that our salary in general is pretty low. But for example, in Ireland, they offer up to 26 weeks, but only with 34% of your salary. So that is quite crazy to think that from one side, society tells you, yes, have families, have children, this is the way our country goes forward. But from the other side, you kind of get penalized for it. And that's why also, I think another fact why men don't take that many paternity leaves, besides social bias and other factors, is that they normally earn more. So therefore, it makes sense for them to keep working. It's for the good of the family as well, so that they actually have a higher income during that period.
So it's self-reinforcing in that way that like men earn more, so it makes more sense for them not to take that shared maternity leave or shared parental leave. And so it's perpetuated. I mean, that's one of the big arguments I've heard for that, use it or lose it, which may have flaws that you mentioned, but that is that has a huge use. You've mentioned a lot of societal things there. There are a huge number of biases and pressures saying to women, even in this period, yes, you've got to have a family. Yes, you got to do this. Also have a career, but you've got to take care of the children, got to do that kind of stuff. And the opposite, I've heard from a number of people that in Denmark, they really want men to teach young kids. There's a real shortage of men teaching young kids, but also there's this huge bias that when people see men with young kids, they assume that there's something dodgy going on, that it's really weird that a man would be with kids. Whereas if they see a woman with kids, they're like, well, could be a mother or a caretaker or anything. So there's pressure on women and pressure on men to not do those things that would be beneficial to women.
I just wanted to add, I feel like I would be remiss as an American to not mention that we're talking about family leave as something that is important, but can also perpetuate inequality in some ways, and that can in some ways have unintended negative consequences for women in the workforce. I come from a country that doesn't have mandated leave for either mothers or fathers at the federal level. So some women are fortunate enough to work for companies that have a paid leave policy, but no woman in America is actually protected at the federal level and entitled to paid leave. So some women have to quit their jobs to have a child. They have to take their vacation days. There's actually this really pernicious, quote, heartwarming trend in the U.S. To give as a baby gift to your colleague your vacation days for her maternity leave. So this is what passes for heartwarming in my home country. Wow. So instead of getting her a gift certificate, get together with all the coworkers and pool your vacation days so that she can take maybe a month off before coming back to work. We also don't have subsidized childcare.
Yeah, I mean, and this is an important note. We're in Denmark, and there's certainly things they could do better. But it also shows that you can do things, so we can definitely improve, but there are definitely worse examples.
But why I think it's interesting to actually contrast places like the US and Denmark is because, on the one hand, yes, looking at the US really underscores how Denmark and most EU countries have really done a tremendous amount, like by having universal paid maternity leave and even paternity leave. But it doesn't necessarily bear out in the way that you expect in terms of like gender equality numbers, especially when it comes to the workplace. So, for example, 28% of managers in Denmark have been found to be female, but this is actually way behind the US, where 43% of managers are women, even though the US ranks 51st in the World Economic Forum's Gender Gap Index. So these things aren't necessarily correlated in the way that people expect them to be. And so one of the, I think, challenges that a place like Denmark faces is just a sort of blindness to the persistent problems, the problems that weren't magically fixed by adopting these very progressive policies several decades ago. So this is an idea that's called sort of post-feminism, and I think Denmark has a pretty post-feminist mentality that can sort of blind them to the fact that these inequalities have not been necessarily solved by progressive family leave policies, whereas the U.S. is very much not in a post-feminist mindset. You can't be when women are still not able to take paid leave from their jobs.
Yeah, and there's that element of complacency that can sneak in when something good has been achieved, but there's more that can be done, and you can also lose that good if you're not aware of it. I remember very much during my undergraduate, there was a trend at the time of posts on the internet of women with like, I don't need feminism because, and it was totally, I understand why people maybe thought that, but the whole thing would not have existed without feminism, and it's just that blindness to history in a certain sense.
Yeah, a lot of the equality has really been fought for. Like right now, we look up to Iceland as being number one always with the in the global gender gap index. It's just remained on the top forever. But actually, they had a huge strike in 1970-75. Because the UN had made like a women's year, and they were also dissatisfied with their salaries and with their working conditions and all. So therefore, 90% of the working women, they took to the streets and they just didn't work a minute in one day in October. And the next year they passed the law for Gender Equality Act there in Iceland. And kind of like the whole mentality of the country shifted, because it's not a very big country in terms of people living in it. But that, they fought for it. And then 1980, Iceland became the first country in the world to elect a woman to run their country.
Solidarity and strikes. Yeah. Always a good tool. But I think that also, talking a little bit about that history, that also shows, we talk about being in equal societies, or, there's a general idea that our societies are equal. But Iceland's first female leader was in the 1980s. There's a lot of countries that have never had a female leader. There's clearly still division within those fields. Denmark actually is one of the better ones and has a female prime minister now, but there's still huge imbalances within that. So we've talked a lot about parental leave. What about the other kind of areas that enforce that division of labor? Do you think that's the only aspect that causes women to be in different jobs, or the cultural norms?
I think cultural norms within particular industries and types of jobs can also be really problematic. Probably, again, disproportionately affecting women who have children. So, for example, if it's an industry, like advertising or something where there's a culture of going out and networking and schmoozing and, eating and drinking with your clients, oftentimes those sorts of things are covered by expense accounts. Like you can put a dinner with potential clients on your expense report, maybe even a hotel, but you can't get childcare or babysitting covered. So that sort of thing is going to disadvantage a woman with a child disproportionately. Same thing in academia. There is a lot of expectation to show up at lectures after hours, or to go to a conference and then go network with your colleagues after hours at the conference banquet. And this can be, for various reasons, just more difficult for women to do than for men.
I mean, the expectations of free time used in academia are kind of absurd.
And also just in general how women are kind of still perceived now. It also, like when we have discussed a bit that women are lacking in the leadership positions and as being CEOs. And for example, here in Denmark, the executives, like 14% of women that are up there, which is quite a small number. So I think that's also about the general cultural view of women is still that they should be nice and they should be kind of soft. And for example, if I draw an example from my own industry, music industry, then women are very often also put there to be kind of appealing in terms of sex. So it's so I think this all affects also the fact that we find so few women in executive positions and management positions, because they are kind of expected to behave in a different way. So therefore, this leadership position is kind of not fitted for them. And of course, this is changing, but it's kind of a slow change.
And the idea that like traditionally feminine traits aren't good for leadership, that you've got to be sort of masculine and strong-willed, as opposed to, listening to people or caring about the people. Exactly. Not that those are necessarily traits that are realistically gendered, but those are the stereotypes.
Yes, stereotypes.
I can add something to this about my field as well. So I think there can also be a problem when an industry has certain metrics for evaluating merit that aren't comprehensive of all the things that are actually required for the job or the organization to function. So, for example, in academia, your ability to keep your job and get promoted is predicated on a very small and narrow number of things that you do. So publishing is the main one. And then you're supposed to teach, but it's dramatically undervalued relative to research. So publication is the main thing. But there's so many other things that faculty members actually have to do to keep this large organization running. You have to work on committees. You have to go to faculty meetings. You have to participate in certain types of trainings. So at AU, they have mandatory training for teaching in the university that amounts to like over 100 hours that you're supposed to do before you get promoted. And I've done this training now, and I was just so mystified that out of like 70 some people, there was a handful of men. Like I could count them on one hand. And I asked around about it, and it turns out that when these sorts of mandatory trainings are advertised, the women take it as mandatory. They do it. Somehow the men just end up going up for tenure and they're like, oh, yeah, I didn't do that thing. They're not actually not going to be promoted for not doing the important mandatory training. It's just sort of overlooked. So women take certain responsibilities seriously because it's important to, or because it is value adding to their job, or it gives them important competencies. But in the end, they can be punished for that because their male colleagues may have just been looking ahead with their eye more on the prize of, I am going to use this time just to do publications. I'm going to spend less time on teaching because my course evaluations are less important ultimately than my publication record. It makes them, I think, worse colleagues in a lot of ways, and it allows parts of the system to suffer, but it can actually benefit them in terms of promotion and salary and other things.
Yeah, so there's a lot of implicit biases and quite likely conscious biases as well when it comes to promotion. And I don't think we should overlook also that there are some people who are out and out sexist that won't want women to be around. Let's move on more to sort of personal experience. You guys come from different backgrounds and different work contexts. Would you mind sharing a little about your own experiences of it, or what you've noticed about your industries? And we've had a little bit about academia, which always makes my ribcage clench. What about you, Kirsi? What about in the music industry? Like, sort of, what trends are there? How does it operate?
So in the music industry, then the most prestigious professions to have is, of course, being a professor at the music academy, then owning a record company or being a decision maker there, or owning the venues and being in the management of venues that decide who gets to play in the more prestigious festivals and venues. And when we look at the facts, then GAFA, a music magazine, made a study last year, 2020, where they found that 69% of the teachers here in Denmark at conservatory levels are men. And also record company owners and decision makers there are 85% men, and also the owners for venues and making decisions there are 82% men. So when we look at those numbers, then we also kind of get a very one-way view on what is expected of women in the industry, because it is mostly men that make the decisions for what they want to see on the screen, what they want to see on the venues. And it is great that it is finally been addressed, because just in the beginning of February, the Danish radio released an article admitting that, actually also on the radio we only play about 20% of music written by female composers. And they are primarily young female composers. So besides kind of a bit of a sexist angle, there is also an ageism involved in that, especially when it comes to women. So there is still a lot of the male view that we see on the screen, and also in terms of what instruments women play. When we turn on the television, then what we mostly see women do in music industry is be singers or be solo acts. It is very rare to see in the commercial image a female that plays an instrument, especially a rhythmic instrument. And coming back to the conservatory level, it's there is only 11% of women that teach a rhythmic instrument. So there is a huge bias with that as well. So besides not having leadership positions like in decision making, women are also kind of forced to be in that very specific space of a singer or a singer-songwriter mostly, so that they also get to accompany themselves, which makes it very limited. And another study they made is also like they went to music schools in 2019 and collected data on different instruments, and like we're trying to understand why are girls like choosing certain instruments. For example, there is a overwhelming number of girls that choose flute, for example, for an instrument, and violin, and also piano. But when it comes to, for example, drums or guitar or bass, then it is a vast majority of boys that have taken that. And I, as a guitarist, I have also very, very acutely sensed it, being the only female always in my guitar class, starting from music school to a higher music school to a conservatory. I mean, even here in Denmark. The first 3 years I studied here, I was the only female in my department. And now as a guitar teacher, I'm also the only guitar teacher, actually. So whenever I go to conferences, I am the only woman looking around in the sea of men. So it is just very limited options, I feel, that women have in the industry. When we look a bit more closely at the classical music industry, then things are slightly better. There is still a bias in terms of choosing the instrument, that there are many more flute players and violinists and harp players as women, and the brass section is always made of men when we look at orchestras. But I would have an example to show that bias, which is that in the 70s in America they implemented a system of blind screening for the musicians. So when they auditioned, then it was a blind audition, so that the jury wouldn't see who is playing, if it's a male or a female. And pre-70s, there was about 6% of women in the orchestras. Then by the 90s, it was already upwards 25 to 30%. And looking at the numbers now, then in the largest European orchestras, it's around 36%, in the UK 44%, and in the Northern America it is 40%. So it is much better, but still there are a lot of instrument biases still within the field. So you don't see really women play a brass instrument in orchestras. So there are still certain gendered options of what you get to play and what you get to be. But I think the biggest problem is that we don't have many women who are actually conservatory professors, so we do not have role models to pursue that. So when a little girl looks at the television and sees loves music and sees that there are only female singers out there, then she's more likely to choose that path. But there is not enough diversity.
Yeah, it's weird that it's something quite simple that somehow always gets overlooked, that we like people who are like us, right? So especially when you're young, you're going to look at someone who's like you and go, well, that's a possibility. And if you don't see anyone who's like you doing something else, then you might not consider that. And vice versa. Also, all of those men who are predominant in those fields, maybe it's not conscious. I know I would like to give people the credit. But there might be some fundamental thing. They just feel more comfortable. They feel more like, oh, this guy, he's a friend. I get on with him. He's like me. So you'll help him a little further on, Is there anything else other than that kind of bias and role models that makes those things persist? Why there aren't many female guitarists, for instance, especially when I was a teenager, every guy plays guitar. I play guitar, not particularly good. Why is it not a thing that seems an option for women?
So there is still a lot of stereotyping that women, should be soft and nice and lyrical, and men are more related to aggression and putting themselves really in front. And for example, instruments like guitar, bass, and drums, they are considered more aggressive, kind of rock instruments, and therefore more male. Mm-hmm. But then, for example, flute and singing, that's very feminine. Flute is high register, it is a very lyrical instrument, and then therefore it fits the stereotype of feminine. So I think a lot of the ways the instruments are still viewed is that either they are feminine or masculine. And unfortunately, the instruments like drums, electric bass and guitar, they are very masculine. So therefore, less girls would choose that as an instrument. I personally didn't care because I just love guitar. But unfortunately, looking around, I am more of an exception.
We're so primitive in some ways. We're just like, well, I associate these things, so that's just how I'm going to run my life. It's so strange. And I remember we talked about this before, that if it's an all-female band, that's a thing. No one mentions if it's an all-male band. That's just the norm. So thank you, Kirsi, for talking about the music industry. Rebekah, we've mentioned the sort of academic industry, and I have cringed in horror at it. Is there anything more you'd like to say about that?
Yeah, I think one other really well documented source of inequality in academia has to do with teaching responsibility and the fact that much like women are sort of delegated to certain sorts of tasks and often lower prestige positions in many industries, this is also true in academia. And there's evidence that women are disproportionately saddled with teaching, which is less valued for promotion and tenure. And then there's also this pernicious phenomenon of bias in course evaluations, so evaluations from students, which it really depends on the university how much that matters, but they actually tend to have quite a big effect on faculty. And it's really well documented that women are disproportionately disfavored by student course evaluations. So there have been some more qualitative studies, some sort of survey-based studies, collecting data, aggregated data from real courses, but there have also been some controlled experiments where, for example, there'll be an online course, so it's strictly offered online without any sort of face-to-face exposure to the teacher, and then half of the students will be told that the course was taught by a man, half will be told that it was taught by a woman, and students will not only report that the quality of the course was worse if they are in the women group, but they'll also say things like in the male group, they'll report that their papers were graded faster and more competently, even though it's done by a computer. And there's no gendered teacher behind the course itself. So we know that this is a real phenomenon. I did a little study of a corpus of course evaluations at Aarhus University just to look at the kinds of words that male and female students tended to use for their professors, male and female. And it was a very skewed data set because, as is typical, male professors greatly outnumbered female professors, but there was definitely a tendency for the evaluations of women to focus more on their attitude, how nurturing they were, and for male professors, the focus was more about their intellectual rigor or the fact that they were considered brilliant or geniuses. These don't seem like gendered words, but we actually have a lot of data that suggests that they're used in a gendered way, and women suffer for that. So this is an expectation that students have for female professors that they don't for male professors. If they want an extension, if they're having personal problems, if they need help, they're not going to their male professors at the same rate that they go to their female professors. And it's not really talked about a lot as a problem, as a systemic problem. So.
Not a single student ever came to me for pastoral care. And I think I'm a fairly friendly person. But also there's so much stuff that we've talked about, all those cultural biases, you're talking about genius and that kind of stuff. Like network is so key to getting promotions in that field, that all of the stuff we've been talking about, it again and again and again it applies. But okay, so we talked we've talked a lot about this huge problem and how it manifests and what it is. But let's sort of talk about what the consequences are. What effect does it have, and why is this important? There is clearly a moral argument that it's wrong if we believe in gender equality and that kind of stuff, but some people aren't necessarily convinced by that argument. Obviously, the first effect is women have less money. Why does this matter?
Well, because it perpetrates the dependence, because then women have to rely much more on men in terms of economy. Also, it continues the patriarchal pattern, and which is kind of stays stagnant in it. And in general, it's just weighing down women and not enabling them to use their full potential, because even right now, women make up 37% of the GDP or the global gross domestic product. But we already saw that number get to that, in a rapid state when women were allowed to work in more varied professions. So I think that increasing it even further, then women also economically, would contribute so much more globally. So there is also that change that would definitely happen.
Rebekah?
Yeah, Kirsi made great points. I completely agree. Also, pay inequality isn't the only inequality facing women. So we also know that there's still very high rates of gender-based violence all over the world, and women are more likely to need to leave unsafe situations or partnerships or domestic situations due to the potential of or reality of violence. And I think it's been shown time and again that one of the biggest impediments to women seeking safety is financial dependency. And there are many other factors, but that certainly is a big one. If, as a society, we want to ensure that not only equality for women in the workplace, but also greater safety for women, those actually, I think, go hand in hand.
And I mean, this is kind of why this podcast exists, why our group exists, because economic inequality is the way so many other inequalities manifest, like you say, and it maintains those inequalities. I'd also like to go back to the example you gave of some of the first programmers. We can just have a much richer cultural and intellectual life as well. Like some of the people who were literally calculating the calculations to send people to the moon were black women who had to use segregated toilets, right? Segregated everything. That's a huge waste of potential there. These people are so constrained, and they literally got people to the moon. There wasn't prestige in it, like we've talked about, so it was kind of overlooked. But now we're seeing these stories again. So it'll help people who are suffering, help kind of close this gap, and also it'll make society better on so many levels.
I'm glad that you brought that up also, because one thing that we haven't really talked about yet is the fact that inequalities tend to compound one another. And so where there is gender-based inequality, what we always see is that racial and ethnic minorities are also disproportionately affected by these inequalities. So
absolutely.
I couldn't actually find data on this for Denmark, unfortunately, but the wage gap in the US based on gender, so white women make about 80 cents to the dollar of white men, but for black women, it's 62 cents to the dollar. Hispanic or Latino women, it's 54 cents to the dollar. American Indian or Alaskan Native women, it's 57 cents to the dollar. So almost half their income. So this is really important to point out that we can't talk about gender in isolation. We also need to take into account gender minorities and non-binary people and trans people, because we always see that they are also disproportionately affected by economic and workplace inequality.
Absolutely. You said it so perfectly. I don't really have anything to add.
Why can't I find this data for Denmark? Like, I would love to know what like Somali women make in Denmark relative to ethnic Danish women.
Well, transparency,
right?
On all levels. I mean,
Yes.
they keep it under lock and key for a reason, because also the companies I mentioned earlier about the pay transparency. I mean, why don't they just spend that tiny amount of money, what they actually make in a huge company, right, to make it transparent? But no, because otherwise they would be facing a lot of legal suits where they have to spend a lot more. I mean, I think it's for a reason.
Yeah, relying on the kindness of a large company is not going to get us anywhere. Okay, so there's consequences, there's problems. What about solution? I know it's a very complex issue, clearly, and it has a lot of different elements to it. So it's not like there's going to be one panacea that we can go, oh, we just do this and it'll all be fixed. Because really, it's multiple different problems. But are there any good policies you've heard of, or are there any potential ones with problems? I know, Kirsi, you mentioned blind auditions, for instance, in your industry, which I suppose helped steer away people from unconscious or conscious biases. Is there anything similar, or any solutions that have been tried that you know of?
So I can't think of sort of one-size-fits-all solutions that would work across, all industries or contexts, because I think the blind auditions one is a really great example for a case where you can really control the factors that go into bias by blinding.
Yeah, but I think that's also only by gender, because it hasn't helped for example, the blacks and the Latinos to get into the orchestras because of the socio-cultural and socio-economic factors, since they can't simply afford to go to those fancy colleges. But it is still like between white men and white women, yes.
Exactly. So we can instate these kind of more fair policies for, say, evaluation. Like, we have double-blind review. It's very common in academia, which I think is meant to do something similar, but it doesn't really solve the kind of pipeline problems. So the very fact that we have more in Denmark, we have more PhD student women than we have men, but we have only 17% of full professors at Aarhus University are women. So, it doesn't really matter if you solve one part of the discrimination puzzle, if there are so many other factors at play that sort of alienate and push out women at different stages of their career. I would say that in in general, it feels like the themes that have come out of this conversation for maybe working towards solving these problems would be data. So data that takes into account gender differences and biases, more research at the more local level, awareness, transparency, and accountability. So what could we achieve if it became mandated or at least more normalized to have transparency about salary and promotion that also takes into account gender, so that we know exactly how big these gaps are. Having more accountability for people who make policy and hiring and gatekeeping decisions. So actually, if you want to make change, you're going to have people be accountable for making sure those changes happen. And I think this is often cited as a problem in universities, that there's never a shortage of diversity and equity and inclusion initiatives. I mean, we've got all sorts of workshops and all sorts of lectures and all sorts of brochures, but it doesn't actually seem to affect a lot of change. So I think accountability is a huge piece of this.
Yeah, I also believe that this change already, since it is very cultural as well, then we can start only addressing it little like from our immediate surroundings, like talking about the issue and acknowledging that there is an issue. I think that would be in many places the first step, because as we said also here in Denmark, there is a lot of this post-feminism that you said, like a post-feminism mentality. We have already done that. I mean, there was the big women's movement in the 70s. We're kind of equal now. There is no problem to be addressed. So I think the first step is to acknowledge there is a problem. It still persists, and there is still a large cultural bias which is not addressed. So really little changes. What we could do is just have more of such podcasts, have more of those articles published on newspapers, and just make people aware as much as possible through events and through just talking and other mediums that we can use.
You'll never get an argument for me against public education. I clearly love it. But so what about like double-blind applications at each stage of application? Would that be helpful at all, or do you think that just kind of sidesteps the issue, or are there flaws in that?
It's not that it sidesteps the issue. It just doesn't take into account still systemic disadvantages that women may face getting to the point of sort of a blind evaluation. Also, I guess the context matters here again. I mean, it sounds to me like the way you get into an orchestra, say, is by like performing a piece of music, and that's the main part of the sort of evaluation in that case. And so just sort of blinding the evaluators to the gender of the performer might actually do a lot to preclude bias. But I think for a lot of fields, there's a whole constellation of things that are taken into account when evaluating, what someone's worth paying or whether they're ready for a promotion. And it may be a combination of, say, hours worked or recommendations from senior colleagues, or all these things that we know. We have a lot of data that shows that women are disproportionately disadvantaged in these ways. So I don't think that just like blinding to the gender of an applicant, say, is going to necessarily fix things. I do want to echo what Kirsi just said about sort of at the individual level what we can do. And education is really important. Acknowledging that there's a problem is definitely the first step. It's worth noting that everybody is guilty of unconscious bias. I am as well. I have to check and make sure that I don't accidentally under-credential my female colleagues. For some reason, I don't have any trouble remembering that a guy is a professor and associate professor, but I have caught myself forgetting that a female colleague is not a postdoc. This happens all the time. It's really common. There's a perpetual feed on Twitter of women who are taking pictures of posters of them announcing a talk, and it's Dr. Man, woman's name. So no credential there, even though she's a PhD holder. It's really common. And also, there's a citation gap in academia. Men cite themselves 70% more than women. And self-citation counts as citation. And actually, your citation index can be a really important factor in promotion and hiring. So, men get a 70% boost there just by citing themselves. We also know that men cite each other more. So I think we really need to take these things into account when you're evaluating, say, a female academic, and she looks very qualified, but you wonder if she should have more citations based on her number of years in the academy. Stop and think whether that's actually representative of her merit, or whether there may have been many other factors in place that unfairly disadvantaged her in that respect.
I mean, I've read an article recently about in the New Scientist about people having literal citation cabals where they all agreed to cite each other's papers. I think that whole system really needs an overhaul. It's so as if the number of references is a good indicator of anything.
Now I'm going to call all my female academic friends and be like, do you want to join a cabal with me?
Yeah.
I'm going to cite you.
I have just maybe one more thing to add, like thinking of education. But I mean, all of these gender roles that we have to navigate, I mean, they start very early on. And we see that already, like up to the age of 4 or 5, boys and girls, they play as kind of equals, and they don't really kind of understand what comes along with this gender that the society has created. But then past that age, you see specific segregation. And I think that also school systems, they might not be very helpful in kind of addressing that problem. And there was a famous case of this study called Draw the Scientist that they did in classrooms. And I think the first one took place in the 70s. And then all the boys drew 100% a male scientist. And then from the girls, 30% of them drew a female scientist. But 70%, so the majority, was still drawn as male. So even to start from the very bottom, to have more of female representation, for example, and also racially different representation, it would go a long way in the eyes of a child.
Basically what we're saying, it's way too complex an issue to have a simple solution. Like, it needs a complex solution. Campaigns, representation, like you say, even something so simple. I think I've heard people say the write fiction, like, think when you're writing a character, does it really need to be a man? Just think, can you change it? It doesn't even necessarily you have to change anything about the story. Just change who's in it, and it'll broaden up the possibilities that people see you.
Yeah, I know it's not as tidy as having like concrete suggestions for solutions, but one of the problems and one of the dangers is that there's no shortage of say organizations or think tanks or like well-meaning organizations that think they have some sort of silver bullet solution, and it's never really the case. I mean, this is systemic. It's woven into all threads of our lives. I mean, women are biased against women, much as men are biased against women. There's a lot of unlearning to do, but there's still, policy interventions that we could do that I think would certainly mediate some of the problems. But I think it's a long road towards social and cultural change. We can't completely solve it with some, clever interventions.
I mean, we live in a very technocratic context.
Yeah.
And there's always, like you say, people looking for that silver bullet. But ultimately, when it comes down to changing a culture, you could have education programs. You can mandate something in schools. But ultimately, you have to change people's minds. Yeah,
and also the family model. I mean, that's the first idea we get about genders, our mother and father.
I guess I would also just add that in terms of the, education and awareness, while it is really important to make people aware of the bad news, that is the degree of inequality that's persistent even in relatively gender equal places like Denmark, it's also really important to make sure that people understand that this is not just about over promoting and over entitling women over men. It's not just about giving women promotions and higher income and bonuses at the expense of men. It is about actually finally achieving equality. And there are reasons why we want to actually take steps and make interventions that will make some of these numbers even out more. So for example, with leadership, there's been a lot of study recently of what are important leadership attributes. So coming up with an actual quantifiable scale. And one that's used widely is one that has like 19 different attributes that make for a good leader. And out of a survey was conducted from 2016 to 2019, surveying 60,000 leaders, only 22,000 of whom were women because of that gap. But what was found was that women consistently outscored men in 17 of the 19 categories that make for a good leader. So this isn't the result of women not being qualified or just inherently lacking the characteristics that we want for people in management or leadership positions. It's about something else. And also, the consulting company McKinsey found that companies that are in the top quartile for gender or racial or ethnic diversity are more likely to have financial returns above national industry medians. So it's good for business as well. What I find a lot in my conversations, especially with people here in Denmark, is that there's a sense that, if you have a quota system, or, if you take gender into account in hiring decisions to make sure to hire more women to even out the workforce, well, you're disadvantaging men, and you're disadvantaging potentially the company or the organization, and it's just not the case. And people need to understand that.
You're addressing an imbalance, really,
Yeah.
rather than creating one. And I mean, just in terms of talking about leadership, just look at the coronavirus. A lot of the countries that have done by far the best have been ones with female leaders. That's not to say it's because of that, but it certainly disproves the opposite. I think that's about all we have time for today. So I would like to thank you both, Kirsi and Rebekah, for sharing your knowledge and your experience and working together with the Economic Inequality Group on this episode. There's a lot going on in Mellemfolkeligt Samvirke Aarhus, and I believe you guys have something coming up just in the next week for March the 8th.
Exactly, March the 8th. We are going to be celebrating the Women's Fight Day, or just generally known as the Women's Day, the 8th of March. And when normally here in Aarhus, there is always a huge demonstration, which actually is always even bigger than in Copenhagen, funnily enough. This year, of course, we cannot do that in this format, but in collaboration with the Gender Museum Aarhus, which used to be the Women's Museum, we have planned a little treasure hunt. And there are going to be different posts in the central Aarhus, which represent different problems in our society. They are called Stand Against Racism, Stand for LGBTQ+ rights, Stand for Bodily Autonomy, Stand Against Economic Inequality, and Stand for a Green Future. And the concept would be that you can go around from post to post, and in each post you can find different organizations working against these discriminations, and you can learn more about them and their work, and also about the problem itself. So check it out on Facebook. We are going to add the link as well to it, but it's called the Equality March 2021.
So even though we won't be able to meet up for our usual raucous in-person march, we will have a socially distanced opportunity to engage with Women's Day, and also online events.
Yes, there are online events and conducted interviews online as well, and all of the links are available also on Facebook.
And the theme this year is?
It's ligestilling i en krisetid, so it is equality in the time of crisis. And one of the main subtext is the gender pay gap.
Fantastic. So come along to that if you're in Aarhus, and if you can. If you can't, or even if you can come down to the cafe for takeaway at the minute, but hopefully once restrictions have eased up, you can come down and sit in the cafe. Until then, Mellemfolkeligt Samvirke is a Danish NGO that works for a more just and sustainable world, collaborating with global partners worldwide as part of the ActionAid Alliance. In Aarhus, we have over 100 volunteers working together to run a not-for-profit cafe and to campaign and educate in areas ranging from feminism and climate justice to anti-discrimination and economic inequality to queer issues and refugee rights. If you want to get involved with our events or activities and campaigns, even running the cafe, come down, take part. Check out Instagram and Facebook to find out more, or look up Café Mellemfolk and Mellemfolkeligt Samvirke Aarhus, or follow the links we'll be putting in the episode notes. I believe we'll also be putting references from you guys' sources in the episode notes today. And also, if anyone wants more content, check out YouTube, Podbean, or any of the other podcast providers for more episodes and more cool stuff. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and goodbye.
Thank you so much for inviting us.
Thanks so much.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.